It's no secret that when we set out to learn a new skill, the way in which we learn that skill is through practice. That is, we learn to dance the ballet by dancing the ballet, and we learn to play the piano by playing the piano. Of course, Aristotle made this point in the Nicomachean Ethics many, many years ago when he wrote that what we need to learn to do, we learn by doing. For example, we become builders by building and lyre players by playing the lyre. This way of acquiring skill is, of course, meant to be contrasted with the kind of learning that proceeds by, say, memorization or reflection or deliberation alone. It is, of course, also a familiar fact about skills that we continue to practice them long after they have been acquired. That is, we humans have this strange habit of practicing a skill long after it's probable that we will be able to perform it to a reasonable degree of success in a reasonably large number of circumstances. We continue to train, drill, and refine our skills long after we can perform them successfully. That is, often when it comes to skill, practice is involved not only for acquisition, but for ongoing refinement as well. This point about the connection between skill and practice has been appreciated by both philosophers and psychologists for ages. But we might ask, what does practice actually do? That is, if we ask this as a question about final causes, we might answer that practice allows us to acquire and refine our skills. However, taken as a question about formal causes, we might make the question more precise and ask, how does practice change our behaviors so that they go from being awkward, unskilled actions to elegant, skilled performances? That's the question that I'd like to answer in this talk. Well, another relatively uncontroversial, I hope, reply to this question is that practice automatizes the motor routines involved in our skills. So we'd say that as a result of practice, motor routines go from being slow, error-prone, conscious, deliberate, and difficult to control to becoming transparent or automatic. Automatic motor routines can be executed without conscious effort or attention, freeing up cognitive processing for other tasks or thoughts. For instance, providing us with the space to think about our overall strategy or about the expressiveness or aesthetic qualities of a skilled performance. Automatic routines can be executed faster and more accurately than non-automatic slow action plans. And they can be executed in parallel with other tasks, since the cognitive load has been reduced. Again, the idea that automatic motor routines alleviate the cognitive burden of skilled action is pretty widely accepted. So, Bylock and colleagues write, current theories of skill acquisition and automaticity suggest that well-learned skill execution is automated, controlled by procedural knowledge that requires little online attention and control and operates mainly outside working memory. Now, philosophers of many different stripes, all apparently very. By focusing on the underlying processes of automaticity, I'm going to show that this way of thinking about automatic motor routines is only half right. That is, by considering the nature of motor chunking, a process that is widely believed to underlie the automation of motor routines, we will see that a central part of being automatic remains very much cognitive, controlled, and intelligent. At the end of the talk, I'll give some theoretical reason, to believe that this is exactly as it should be. That is, that the automatic processes involved in skill require cognitive control, and they require it to remain flexible, manipulable, and responsive to our goals and reasons. And further, that this simply cannot be achieved if automatic processes become large, fused, mindless motor programs. Motor chunking is the unfortunately named process that facilitates movement production by combining motor elements into integrated units of behavior that can be stored and executed as wholes. The idea is that by combining individual elements into a single motor plan, we have the ability to store these integrated plans and execute them in a way that substantially reduces our cognitive burden. That is, we don't have to think of and execute each element in a sequence individually. Rather, We can store, access, and implement a cluster of elements as a whole unit. So whereas, for example, we would need to control 6 individual elements in a sequence, when those 6 elements are chunked into 2 units of 3, we only need to control, access, and execute those 2 elements. Now, all of this seems right, but it's vital to see that this kind of unitization very likely proceeds in an hierarchical fashion. That is, motor sequence representations are transformed in different ways at different processing levels. And it seems that at least 2 different and opposing processes are involved in motor chunking. As Wims et al. Describes, the processes are, first, concatenation, the formation of motor-motor associations between elements or sets of elements, and second, segmentation, the parsing of multiple contiguous elements into shorter action sets. As I discuss each process and its function in facilitating motor chunking, it should become clear why it is that understanding the nature of chunking challenges the common notion that automatic motor routines are mindless. So let's take a look at each kind of process in turn. The first kind of process responsible for motor chunking is what I'll call, following the scientists, concatenation. This is the process that I think naturally comes to mind when we think of motor sequences becoming unitized or chunked into single motor programs. Concatenation, I'll claim following Wims et al., is best thought of as an associative learning process, where motor elements are combined into larger sets or units. So, individual elements of a sequence or task are fused or bound into larger units that have fewer parts. That is, the connection between elements becomes stronger. There are 2 kinds of evidence that I'll appeal to in order to elucidate the nature of concatenation. The first, direct fMRI evidence, and the second, evidence from disorders of motor learning. Wims et al. Used a queued sequence production task, and through that they analyzed sequence learning using fMRI. What they found was that during concatenation, the occurrence of which was assessed behaviorally, there was increased activation in the basal ganglia. Now, this result should be unsurprising since the basal ganglia has long been implicated in motor learning, especially in procedural learning and the production of implicit, automatic, habitual behaviors. This is clear since individuals with Parkinson's disease are well known to have difficulty executing implicit automatic actions, and that's thought to be due to deficits in the dopamine uptake of the basal ganglia. Other individuals with basal ganglia stroke have also experienced motor sequence deficits. Both groups fail to chunk motor sequences in the same way as healthy controls. Now, importantly for our purposes, neither patients with Parkinson's disease nor those that have suffered basal ganglia stroke seem to have any deficits when it comes to explicit knowledge of motor sequences. That is, in recognizing or reporting the sequences or repeated portions of a sequence involved in a motor task. All of this supports the fact that concatenation is an associative process, since first, the basal ganglia seems critically involved in concatenation, as indicated by direct fMRI evidence, and second, that the basal ganglia is an important site of implicit procedural learning, which has little to do with personal level executive function. Now, if concatenation was the only process involved in the automatization of motor sequences, then we'd expect to see something like this. We'd begin with a sequence of, say, 7 elements, and the connection between those elements would become stronger and stronger until the sequence was fused into a single unit, or until, say, it reached the capacity load of working memory, or the motor buffer. And so we'd expect to see something like this. But what we actually see is a bit different. And this is because it appears that there is a second process involved in motor chunking, and that's a process of segmentation, or parsing. This process seems to be responsible for segmenting motor sequences into shorter parts. So parsing appears to work in the opposite direction of concatenation. Interestingly, the process of parsing seems to involve not associative, but executive or control processes. We can conclude this, again, based on two forms of evidence: direct fMRI evidence and considerations based on motor learning deficits that are related to aging and general cognitive decline. First off, Wims et al. Found that in sequences that were easier to segment and thus were more likely to involve segmentation, parsing revealed increased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this area, as is well known, is related to executive function. Another reason to think that parsing involves executive areas is because we see deficits in motor chunking that arise in elderly populations, which are thought to be related to overall cognitive decline in aging. And these deficits are also related to decreased explicit knowledge, that is, the decreased ability to recognize and report on sequence structure. We can visualize parsing in the following way. We'll begin again with a sequence of, say, 7 elements, and then we can see that that sequence is broken down into 2 sets. What's important to notice is that parsing is not just a stage in concatenation. That is, these segments aren't just combined into larger motor units, but they are robust. That is, even though their joints become harder to detect as a result of practice, with the introduction of a dual interference task, we can see that the segments persist even after extensive practice. That is, even after practice of over thousands of rounds. What's more, we know that the parsing of motor chunks is not simply the result of capacity or load constraints. That is, it's not that a motor sequence is only parsed simply because working memory or the motor buffer can't handle more elements in the sequence. And we know this because even sequences with as few as 4 elements tend to be parsed in a robust way into 2 sets of 2 elements. Together then, the way we can visualize chunking is as follows. On one level, we have sequences that are broken down or parsed into smaller units, and on another level, those units are combined or concatenated into larger representations. And as we just saw, the parsing of motor sequences likely involves executive or control functions, and the concatenation is likely the result of lower-level associative processes. And it seems that all of this may give us an explanation of why variability in practice not only produces more efficient learning, but why it is that experts often attempt to reduce the automaticity of their motor routines. As John Sutton writes, in many distinctive domains, elite practitioners specifically resist the kind of automation which Dreyfus describes at the highest levels of expertise, worrying that trusting the body alone to take over will lead to arrested development. Just as they challenge themselves constantly and deliberately in practice, they know that in performance they will be constantly opened up to new limits. As Rietveld argues, every situation contains perturbing influences, with new affective influences always potentially altering our evaluation of significance. So expert performers precisely counteract automaticity because it limits their ability to make specific adjustments on the fly. This would explain why practicing in a variety of circumstances and focusing on different aspects of one's technique at different times is so important for developing expertise. That is, if we think of segmentation as the process by which we achieve control over our motor skills, and we think of variability as the best way in which we can promote parsing or segmentation, or resist concatenation, then we see why variability is so important for skill. Taken together, all of this should help us to see that the mindless conception of automatic motor routines is simply misguided. Rather, we should hold that cognition is involved in both the representation and the implementation of automatic motor routines. That cognition dictates the structure of the representations and our ability to manipulate and control those motor representations in skill execution. So it isn't simply that when it comes to skill, cognitive control is present, say, at the level of strategy or high-level planning, or in terms of aesthetic expressiveness or intentional action. But intelligence is present in the actual execution and implementation and structure of automatic motor routines. That is, it has to be present in the representation and execution of skills if we are going to be able to have the control that is flexible, manipulable, and responsive to our goals, reasons, and wills. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions.